Our speaker is Professor Richard Tanter, who is Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute and Honorary Professor in the School of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Richard is a researcher and writer on the US bases and their influence on Australian foreign policy, and he will be picking up where Vince left it and talking about how to go about getting us unravelling all of this. Over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Kellie, thanks very much, and thank you to both Gareth and Vince. And Vince has made my job much easier. Look, I'll start from the words that he was talking about and what underlay what Gareth was talking about: accountability and transparency. If we're talking as Prime Minister Turnbull and Keating have done, and I imagine Malcolm Fraser would have done, in terms of sovereignty, and that was a phrase that Fraser used quite consciously, the essence of sovereignty is having control over the legitimate operations of your own government. And if there are foreign influences, they are acknowledged and under control. That requires that governments be accountable. As Vince made very clearly, in the current circumstance, and Gareth has made very clear apropos AUKUS, there is virtually no attempt at accountability. The Australians for War Powers Reform, which a number of people on this call have been involved in for over a decade, made the point, going back to the campaign for a Iraq war inquiry, and now for the basic issue of under what circumstance will Australia go to war. The issue of parliamentary approval was offered as one modest constraint on a government. Of course, that's been totally ignored. But if you look at AUKUS, at everything that Gareth has said, in terms of its complexities and the changes that he's registered in his own opinion, which I understand well, there has been no accountability, not even an attempt at accountability. We have had a couple of parliamentary inquiries, I think with public debate time, public consultancy times of 2 weeks, magnificently extended to 3 weeks, on relatively constrained nuclear safety measures. There has been no serious debate, let alone decision-making in the Parliament about what Gareth absolutely points out. Well, certainly it's the worst foreign policy decision ever by Australian government, but the implications, which both speakers have unpacked very clearly, are enormous. So one issue, if we're talking about sovereignty, if we're talking about independence, one related issue is the question of how dysfunctional our government is in addressing these kinds of issues. And transparency and accountability, I think, are the kind of mantras that we need to focus on. I'm going to go in and out of focus in this. What do we want at the broadest level? Well, I think we start with Australia without nuclear weapons, non-nuclear defence, no nuclear weapons in Australia as an absolute demand, not mitigated by, well, maybe extended deterrence might be involved in the defence of Australia. I think at a certain point, a militancy and absoluteness of demand is really important. And I'll come back to this in relation to the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, and as Vince has pointed out, its relationship to Tindal in the sense that it permits the United States, Australia permits the United States to bring nuclear weapons into Australia without hindrance. And secondly, in relation to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, no nuclear weapons. That seems to me the starting point. Secondly, Gareth talked very appropriately, and I have to say, almost anachronistically, and I don't mean as any insult to Gareth, but rather how appalling our situation has become, that clearly, as Keating said, not just last week, but a decade and a half ago, or 2 decades ago, Australia's future must lie with Asia. Zhou Enlai said it very clearly in 1955 at the Bandung Conference. Sooner or later, he said, Australians will realise that. It's taking a long time to come. The former deputy chair, or the former head of the Office of National Assessments, Jeff Miller, the other day, just in Pearls and Irritations, made clear that he thought the fundamental of Australia's strategic policy has to be not accommodation with China, but seeking a future in which the security of China is a matter to be recognised and calculated and accepted, not, as Vince and Gareth have made very clear, opposed, quite frankly, with nuclear weapons. Secondly, or thirdly, again, both speakers have talked about the way in which we need to be very clear. Australian defence, which is a real issue that has to be talked about, is being enfeebled and endangered by almost everything to do with AUKUS and, as Vince said, the B-52s. And it's been enfeebled by the irrationality and unsustainability of AUKUS in particular. Fiscally, I can't imagine where any of the money is going to come for anything else, and whether or not those anything else's are things that we want is another matter. And so essentially, rational, transparent and accountable decision-making in defence. I mean, if you listen to people in the defence trade, defence industry, listen to someone like Kim Bergman, the editor of Australia Pacific Defence Reporter, no radical, but week after week in his podcast, he assails the utter lack of transparency in the Defence Department, in defence procurement, in defence operations about, well, absolutely non-nuclear things. He doesn't even get to that. He's got so much else to talk about. This is very serious. And so when people, I'm sorry to embarrass you again, Kellie, like Kellie or Michelle Fahey, devote their attention to unpacking the ways in which government policy is unaccountable, that's a critical area there. I want to shift to talk about the black holes, as I call them, not in the detail that Gareth did about AUKUS or the detail that Vince has about our collective work, and in particular the lovely comments he made at the end about the way in which the United States is conditioning Australia by getting operational integration with American nuclear operations under the heading of integrated deterrence, but now wanting to move to actual commitment by the Defence Department, a la NATO, a la South Korea and Japan, to having membership of a NATO-like joint nuclear planning committee. Something like that is definitely on the cards. And I'll just say, one of the things that came out very clearly from the work that we did in our next study on the B-52s in the 1980s, we were fortunate to get a whole cache of US Pacific Command histories, internal, highly secret, but subsequently declassified documents. And what that made clear are two things: the way in which decisions about Australia and B-52s in Australia in the 80s by both the FAIIA government and the Hawke government were construed in Australia from a very Australia focus. This was something that Malcolm did because of his Cold War obsessions or something of that sort, which was not wrong, but it was largely irrelevant. What the papers reveal is the long-term American planning and using pressure on one country against another. If Australia hadn't acceded to the B-52s, then pressure was being put on Papua New Guinea, newly independent. It was being put on Korea and Japan, and it was being put on the Philippines. This long-term planning is exactly what we should be expecting to be faced on AUKUS, on the B-52s, and a great deal more. The point I'd make about I just come back, the only real thing I want to say about AUKUS is to back up Vince's point that I think it is very plausible, highly plausible, that we will in future see the United States rescind that presidential directive in 1991 by George Bush the Elder, the sensible one. And one of the things to recall at that time was the US Navy said, yes, we'll take the nuclear weapons off our ships and off our attack submarines, leave them on the ballistic missile submarines, but we reserve the right to bring them back. It was explicitly entered into the papers as a caveat. And indeed, as Vince said, there is indeed a very clear pathway to that it can be removed at that restraint at the stroke of a presidential pen. And secondly, there is a very serious development proposed by the Trump administration, fumbled by Biden, but finally Congress has come back and demanded production of the sea-launched cruise missiles, SLCM bracket N for nuclear. These are overtly, explicitly in congressional documents specified as being required for Virginia-class submarines. And that's what we're talking about, coming to HMAS Sterling. That can all change. Nuclear weapons can come in. I want to say something quickly about the B-52s, very, very quickly. Firstly, the model which is being utilised for RAAF Base Tindal is essentially the military equivalent of fly-in, fly-out workers, fly-in, fly-out aircraft based in 2 bases in the continental United States. B-52s will fly over about 23 hours to Australia. They'll be here on rotational deployment for weeks, months. We don't know the answer to that. Up to 6 of them in current capabilities. But the infrastructure on which the US government is spending $500 million of their money just for the US Air Force facilities at Tindal will be accompanied by our count at the moment, 75 or plus permanent US staff. As Gareth said, that changes Chinese strategic planning about that. Vince mentioned the way in which the United States might, in a crisis, put nuclear weapons on B-52s. They'll probably carry them to Australia on transport planes, but could load them onto B-52s. That's not just a possibility. It's a possibility explicitly identified in US Air Force safety regulations and in command regulations, which we have documented. That brings me to the really important point here, which is all this is going together, if you like. The lack of restraint on bringing nuclear weapons in is underpinned by what Australia itself enabled in the Treaty of Rarotonga. And if I can just share with you a little bit for one moment about the Treaty of Rarotonga and about the B-52s. Hang on. Two elements of nuclear permissiveness, if you like. Now, firstly, on the B-52s, this is just a slide from the B-52s book. We have a policy of not only accepting and understanding US doctrines of neither confirm nor deny, but we actually have another version of that, and we simply do not ask. And that's a government statement from a former Chief of the Air Force. This is a kind of fake deniability. It's a fake version of, oh, well, it's plausible deniability. It's implausible, it's a lie, and it's an extremely dangerous one. We looked, and when we were testing out the provisions for the current B-52s, about which the government has been, both the Morrison and Albanese governments have been appallingly non-transparent. We went back to look at what Malcolm Fraser had did, and we all know Fraser's dispositions of a certain kind there. But what was really important, in 1981, when Fraser announced this, he insisted that the Americans tell Australia whether the B-52s coming into Darwin and flying over Queensland, Western Australia and Northern Territory were nuclear armed. And then Fraser insisted that he had the right to inform the Parliament. And then he forced the United States to confirm in public that that was indeed the case, that they were not armed, they carried no nuclear weapons, and the host government informed the public. Fraser made the agreements public. There are many other problems there, but he made them public. That has not happened. That has not happened at all in relation to the Albanese government. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about, again goes back to the 1980s, is the Treaty of Rarotonga. This is the one sort of detailed part of what I want to say. And I'm taking a risk of speaking in front of a former Attorney General about this, so beware of my legal lack of skills. The Treaty of Rarotonga, which was signed in 6th of August 1985, established the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. Australia chaired the drafting negotiations. Under that treaty, the stationing of nuclear weapons in Australian waters and territories is prohibited, as it is in every other state party to the treaty. But the treaty, largely at the Australian urging, does not prohibit or define transits or visits of nuclear armed ships and aircraft. They are not prohibited. Australia incorporated its right under the treaty to decide freely whether it wanted to allow the foreign ships and aircraft, nuclear armed ships, into Australia, with an act in 1986, one section of which prohibits the stationing or possession of nuclear weapons in Australia, but another section of which says, well, otherwise there can be transits and visits of nuclear weapons. I'll leave this for the organisers to look at. But there's a particular provision there, section 15.2 in particular. What needs to happen, this simply means there is no policy or legal restriction on nuclear weapons coming into Australia. So our first demand, prevent nuclear weapons coming into Australia, rescind that section 15.2, take it out. And one way of dealing with the matters that it deals with there is to follow the example of the New Zealand Act, that came about a year later, I should say, which in the case of aircraft, the Prime Minister, when considering whether to grant approval to the landing in New Zealand of foreign military aircraft, the Prime Minister will have regard to information about the strategic and security interests of Australia, and in particular, satisfy herself or himself that the foreign military aircraft will not be carrying any nuclear explosive device when it lands in New Zealand. That's a big ask, and it really comes to what I want to talk about, which is the essence of a non-nuclear Australia, of moving Australia back from one part, at least, of that new nuclear posture that Vince has alluded to, is to find a legislative way of preventing this, of removing our nuclear permissiveness of that. I guess what I'm arguing for is a kind of nuclear politics which has some measures of absolutism about it. No nuclear weapons, just this should not be compromised with. But also argues that in a range of areas, in legislation, in strategic doctrine, in our overall foreign policy, on issues of government accountability and transparency for its own decisions. And here, for example, I'm thinking that something that Kellie and I have done together of trying to get out of the Albanese government the list of bases which, under an MOU with the United States following the Forced Posture Agreement, allows the United States into what appear to be a long list of agreed facilities and operations where US forces and contractors can go. We have asked repeatedly for the government to make that list clear. Now, it could be that there's something unbelievably sensitive in there which has some genuine security need, although I very much doubt it. When we look at other countries, not known for their extraordinary independence and assertions of sovereignty, like Hungary or Poland, which all have a lot of American bases, a lot of new American bases, they have required the American government to allow them to publish that list of agreed facilities and areas. It's not clear to me whether the Americans have prevented us doing it, or more likely, Australia's aversion to accountability has led to us censoring that. So I'll finish there and just say what I think we need is a whole multi-layered approach to these issues. Gareth's very genuinely informative and passionate account of where we are in relation to AUKUS is also a very depressing one because it carries a certain fatalism. I don't know whether there's any way through AUKUS, but I'm very sure that the AUKUS process is going to come unstuck very badly. Just give the simple example. I know Dave Sweeney's on the line here from ACF, and one of the extraordinary things in the last week has been the way in which the Albanese government, and in particular Mr Miles, attempted to introduce this extraordinary provision in the nuclear safety bill before Parliament, which would have required Australia not only to have taken high-level nuclear waste from Australian submarines when they come, but also from UK and United States submarines. It was just an extraordinary thing that could have been possibly contemplated. And then with what I think was actually reasonably moderate political pressure, it was wiped. There are going to be many more disasters like this along the way, and they give opportunities for intervention. I'll also finish by saying Gareth mentioned our lack of reasons for not being hopeful about external factors. And I can understand exactly why he says so, particularly in the United States. I just ask you to consider rewinding your mental map of those matters, all of us, to go back 18 months. In other words, pre-Gaza, and look at the way in which not just the situation of Israel, but in many respects, important aspects of the Australian automatic support for American power in the world has come to be undermined in our parliament, certainly amongst young people and amongst particular segments of the community. Sometimes events can help. Finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your